Okay.
Can I ask a question
Sure.
about the specific definitions there? Who can produce hemp products? In other words, do the processors have to take it from the flower all the way to the retail bottle, or at what point when can they sell it to who?
That's a great question. To answer your question, what I would say for sure is that Georgia has definitely covered from growth to harvest to receipt after harvest. That's the processors. Then you have the processors, and that's certainly covered there in the process. Okay. We've covered already a lot that hemp flower can't be sold at retail, so it has to be processed. So once processed and available to the consumer, I'm not sure where the line is drawn, but I believe, what Georgia's going to say is that you have to have a processor permit to run a shop. I think that's probably a fair assumption, but I don't know that I would agree with that, right? Because the processor's job is to refine it, and I think that this comes up a lot, and I'm going to cover this a little bit more. Think about the inequity of the fact that as a processor, I can process the flower into CBD oil, just basic oil. Let's not get into any of the niceties or details, but I've processed it into oil. I am in, Osaka, Georgia, up north, and I want to sell this. Because I'm in Osaka, I make a deal with someone in Chattanooga to sell all this oil. Okay. I haven't looked at Tennessee's laws, but let us assume that there's no problem.
Very lax
under the law in Tennessee. So I ship a load of oil over the border to someone in Tennessee. They've purchased it, and then they're going to sell it at retail. Okay? They don't need a Georgia processor permit. I don't even know if Tennessee makes them have any kind of special permit to do it. So, as a resident of Georgia, as a businessman in the state of Georgia, I am hampered by the fact that I am in this business in Georgia because the processor can sell to someone in Tennessee that which they cannot sell to me if I'm forced to have a processor permit to a shop. So, and I'll get back to that because that's not the only incidence of that being a problem. But it's a great question. Okay. To your point, presently, the Department of Agriculture regulations, and presently and with revision, the Department of Agriculture regulations actually state that only licensees and permittees are allowed to store hemp. So certainly raw hemp, those are the only people that can actually warehouse it and store it.
But what if I buy it from another state?
Yeah, I'm gonna get there. You're ahead of me, but you're right. So let's move on and get into the unlawful acts, because that's where we saw some significant change in the law this time. Now, the big unlawful act that they were trying to do was make it a misdemeanor to negligently violate the unlawful acts that are already listed. There's 7 of them, most notably selling unprocessed flour, and then a felony if you intentionally violated that law. That portion of the bill was struck because it met with a lot of resistance. There was a lot of noise made about that, and honestly, I'm not sure that it would have survived a constitutional challenge as well. What it does do, and what's beneficial about it, is it clarifies that licensees and permittees can trade in hemp grown outside of Georgia. The current law doesn't let them do that. The requirements are what you might imagine. The state of origin has to be compliant with the USDA's regs. That's no surprise. But licensees can only, presently, growers can only sell to permittees, which of course is not that big a deal because licenses just started being issued, and there's nobody doing any selling out of Georgia, at least legally right now anyway. But in practice, right now, the current state of the law before this bill gets signed into law, if it does, is that growers can't sell outside of Georgia right now. Or Georgia growers can't sell outside of Georgia, which I think would also frustrate the purposes of the Farm Bill of 2018. I don't think anyone was intending to make these states into their own closed economies. You still can't sell raw hemp to the public. We've covered this, but only processors, other growers, and colleges authorized to do research may receive and store raw hemp from a grower. That's within the state, okay? It doesn't really say anything about what happens if you're receiving the hemp from a grower outside the state, and I'm going to come to that in a second. But it also means that only hemp products, as that term is defined, and which now excludes, or which will now exclude flour, can be sold to the public at large. So, that may be an issue for some people. I'm familiar with a business that acts as essentially as a middleman for growers out west that's turning around the raw hemp into the state of Georgia. I still think that's a gray area, but I'd be very cautious from this point forward about dealing like that. I know I spoke to someone recently who said that they trade in hemp flour, and with this new bill, they are essentially having a fire sale of that to make sure that they are not in violation of this law. So let's talk about the issues that this unlawful acts changes have brought about. Licensees can sell hemp outside to anyone outside of the state of Georgia, okay? As long as it's a USDA compliant state and they're authorized to grow or process hemp in the state, okay? So the problem is that different states have different rules. It's not uniform. For instance, a grower in Georgia who does not want to process her own hemp can't sell to a Georgia company that does not have a processing permit, okay? However, they can sell to a California company that wants to do the exact same thing as the Georgia company, because California doesn't regulate the, quote, manufacturing, processing, or selling of non-food industrial hemp or hemp products. And that's even if, for instance, the California company is offering, let's say, $10 a pound less on the hemp that the Georgia grower is trying to sell. So, for a 500-pound sale, that's about a $5,000 loss, because Georgia is being that restrictive, and actually being that restrictive of its own citizens. Company in Georgia which merely wants to import hemp, right, from a grower in California, warehouse it and sell it on to processors in Georgia can't do that under these laws. But a company in California which does the exact same thing can, even though it's far less efficient to have the hemp warehouse in California if it's going to be distributed in Georgia. So it doesn't make economic sense. And I find that anytime you can make a doesn't make economic sense argument to the folks up in the Gold Dome, that's maybe the most persuasive argument you can make. For better or worse, a lot of our elected officials in Georgia are very bottom line about what's gonna be most economically beneficial. So, if you are thinking about trying to talk to your senator about this bill, that is a pitch that I certainly would encourage you to make. Market inefficiency itself is not grounds to strike a law, okay? But equal protection is. And Georgia's Supreme Court has a few times made rulings that have said that treatment of out-of-state residents differently than treatment of Georgia residents doesn't fly. So, I can see that as an angle that's coming on this, and really it's just going to take the right company that's call, a little bit of money, and we'll go get an injunction, okay? So,
Mark?
yes.
Would you be willing, at the end of this, to have 3 main points that people can write their senators about, like what you just said? Awesome. Thank you.
let me also talk about that. Applicants are still required to, applicants for licenses, for grow licenses. And I was pretty surprised that this was included, still required to give the name of the permittee who they intend to contract with. Conversely, anyone applying for a permit also has to identify the licensee from whom they are gonna get their hemp. Well, okay, once again, this is closing the market in Georgia. It's saying that if I want a license in Georgia to grow, I can only do it if I'm going to sell to distributors in Georgia. So if my contracts are all with people from another state, it's at least unclear, if not I'm SOL as a grower. And vice versa, if I'm a permittee that doesn't find Georgia hemp to be all that appealing, but still, have managed to plunk down my $25,000 with the plan to renew it at $50,000 every year, because I have a great deal of confidence in hemp grown in North Carolina. I can't do it per these rules because I have to first contract with a grower in Georgia. I'm not sure if that was intentional or unintentional, but that's a pretty straight read of the statute. So that I think would be a huge problem. I mean, let's all remember that the name of the game here is interstate commerce and growing an industry. And these laws are all trying to sort of like close the doors to interstate commerce. And again, I think, the good news is that we can all say what we want about politicians and what drives them and all that, but one thing that everybody will agree with is that money drives politics. And this is something that's really frustrating an industry that could bring in a lot of money. And when you talk about budget shortfalls in Georgia, right, they need tax money. They need application and license money. And they are not gonna get it when I'm forced to do business in Georgia, when I've got, 4 contracts waiting for me in Tennessee, California, Colorado, and Michigan. I mean, there's other places we can do business, and I just happen to live in Georgia. So, that brings up the point, of course, that the cost of renewing a processing permit has raised up from $10,000 to $50,000 in this new bill, after an initial fee of $25,000. Here's what concerns me about that. Okay, obviously Georgia is serious about it, has planned this, and has decided that they want a processor permit. They're going to turn hemp flowers into CBD. They play by all the rules. They've got to deal with a farm in Georgia. They've got the equipment. They've got the warehousing and everything. They've even got the financing, but that financing planned 5 years down the road at a $10,000 renewable. Suddenly that business is $200,000 short before they even start. And that's a huge problem. A huge problem. Now, I've not spoken to anyone specifically who's had that issue, but I guarantee you there's someone out there who's going to have that problem. And again, it kills the industry before it starts. So, now, a point that you brought up earlier is that the unlawful acts has also now refined its transportation requirements. You no longer need a transportation permit, which was the last incarnation of the rules. Now, what's required is a bill of lading to transport hemp into the state or through the state. Okay. I think this is a problem simply because, again, I don't see anywhere that says that I can't possess 2 or 3 grams of raw hemp flower that I bought in Tennessee. So let us say for the moment that I do that I'm in Chattanooga, that I buy 3 grams of raw hemp flower, get in my car and drive back without really even thinking about the fact that I got it. Get pulled over by a police officer, he says, "Where's your bill of lading?" I said, "Well, why do I need a bill of lading for 3 grams of hemp flower? I mean, it's absurd." And the fact is that it's even possible that between a receipt and good packaging on the flower, you might have all of the things that those bills of lading require. But I don't think you should be required to do that, and I certainly don't think that all these places are going to have receipts.
And wouldn't the Postal Service be under the same guidelines?
Well, the Postal Service, of course, is federal, so they don't have to play by Georgia's rules necessarily, but they certainly could alert Georgia if they X-ray a box and see what appears to be, you know, green leafy substance, to use the cop term, and then, you know, bring them in. Okay. Now, I would think the Postal Service doesn't have to answer to Georgia law. Okay, but the Postal Service could alert, for instance, local sheriff's department, so that essentially, and this has happened to clients of mine before, once alerted, your load of hemp flower is actually being delivered by the GBI. Okay, we'll have questions for you, but if there's a bill of lading, I think, you know, that should answer the question. But then again, it gets back to, can a non-processor, non-grower receive that in the mail? I would fight pretty hard to say that you could.
And the Postal Service only requires that the person mailing the object keep the COAs for 3 years. That's basically their regulations in a nutshell. You don't have to have that in the box. You know?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I would think that as a matter of prudence, anyone who's, you know, having hemp flower delivered to them in the mail would want to make damn sure that there's a COA in it, because, I mean, you're just begging for trouble if you don't. I mean, you're just begging for trouble if you don't.
Would that include like Federal Express? Would that include these other postal carriers, private or whatever, in the industry, other than U.S. Postal, which is, as you say, federally regulated? How does that play a part in what you're talking about?
Well, FedEx and UPS are not bound by the Fourth Amendment, so it's even, I mean, they X-ray everything. I can tell you from personal experience that they run every single thing that travels through their trucks, goes through an X-ray machine first. And if they see something they don't like, it's more or less corporate policy to alert local law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean,
They actually give bonuses for it.
well, I mean, I'm not aware that they get bonuses for it. I wouldn't be stunned. So, the last thing I want to touch on is the fact that, you know, with these unlawful acts, they still don't clarify exactly what happens to you if you do commit one of these unlawful acts. Obviously, what they were trying to do was make it a felony if you intentionally violated these laws. That failed. Now, Georgia actually does have what's called a residual or all-purpose sentencing statute. Okay, it's never used. It's been used 4 times in history. It's been cited 4 times in history in legal opinions. It just says that basically if we say something's unlawful but don't specify the punishment, it's a misdemeanor. And it really does. You can see the legislature saying it's a misdemeanor. I don't know. I really don't know whether that would be how a prosecutor would go forward with it. I know that the bill as originally written referenced that statute, but that can cut both ways. Either they assume that statute applies and so cut the language out, or, as I would certainly argue hard in court, they had a chance to include that as the punishment and specifically excluded it and made the choice not to, and completely failed to tell us what punishment we faced if we did violate the law. So there's a ton of uncertainty right now. The takeaway from that is that you have to be, if you're in this industry, especially if you're dealing with raw hemp flower, be very careful. You know, bills of lading, chain of custody, very important. Document everything. And, you know, if you have problems with law enforcement, then talk to a lawyer. I mean, these are things that can readily be fought in court, but not if you start trying to explain yourself to a law enforcement officer and say the wrong thing. So talk to your lawyer, not the cops, and remember the old adage of even a fish wouldn't get caught if it didn't open its mouth. You had a question in there.
I was going to just follow up on him. You're good.
Okay.
Thank you.
I like
Anyone
that.
questions?
Even a fish wouldn't get caught if it opens
I've got a
its mouth.
few kind of scenarios, comments that I'd love to get your
Although,
opinion on.
still could get put.
With the hemp flower right now, if a law enforcement agent comes up to your car window, you roll it down, he smells cannabis. Basically, that erases your Fourth Amendment right. He can search and seize whatever at that point. Correct?